hand over to Lucy Byatt, the Director of Hospitalfield.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Lucy Byatt. I'm Director here at Hospitalfield, and it's so nice to see so many people, lots of familiar faces and not quite so many familiar faces. So it's good to see new people to Hospitalfield. Something that we are really now getting our thoughts around as we progress with our future plan, which is our capital programme of works, is how we think about our collections, and also, as I sit in one of the oldest rooms in the house, how we deal with some of the conservation of our wallpaper, and leather wallpaper in this room in particular. But really tonight, really what's propelling this talk and quite a lot of our thinking at the moment is a conservation study that we're having done on our painting collection, which is about 300 easel paintings. Now, Hospitalfield has been a terrible environment from the environmental sense. You know, the moisture content in the air goes up and down, up and down. So our project over the next few years is about how we make the house into a place where artists can live and work and stay and still be a resource as it was intended to support artists, but how it can also be an environment in which we can safely keep our collections, how we can tell our story around the collections, how we can add works, and also how we can introduce people to our archives and stores, how we can absolutely start from the point of view of being an open space as well as a place where we might have display and gallery space. So these are questions that we're raising over the next few years as we start the design work on our phase 3 of this long project here at Hospitalfield, which is to kick it into shape, but also to give it some to retain its authenticity as a 19th century project, but also think about it through a 21st century prism and bring all our values and our ideas of today and the future to interpret what we have here. And we're really, really delighted to have Lubaina Himid, artist who knows Hospitalfield quite well, having done a very sort of short residency here in 2016, which resulted in some beautiful commissioned works that you showed here in that year. And I know that you are very passionate about public collections, and that's what we want to hear about tonight. So that's what the conversation is going to be about. So for those people who don't know Lubaina was born in Zanzibar and now works and lives in Preston, which is the centre of the universe in terms of museums, because there are an astonishing array of museums in that part of the north of England. She was the winner of the Turner Prize in 2017 and will open a big monographic exhibition at Tate Modern in November this year, and has works in many collections around you in Manchester, the Whitworth, the V&A and Tate. So you have a very wide range of experiences of working with collections. And also, I think, long memories of your affections for collections.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was brought up on a strange diet of one weekend, my mother and I would go to the big department stores in London and wander around looking at dresses, looking at fabrics, looking at furniture, looking at jewelry, sniffing the perfume, touching scarves, not buying anything, you understand, but just ambling about, perambulating through these beautiful spaces, big, luxurious department stores. And she was looking at the patterns on the fabrics. She was seeing what was current. She's a textile designer, so she's very interested in the fabrics and the patterns, you know. So she'd spend her week painting, but she'd spend the weekend looking at things, you know, and I went along, of course. And then we'd spend the next weekend, or the next Saturday, because it was always a Saturday, in one of the big London museums or another. You know, we'd either be in the Tate, as it was then, which is Tate Britain now, again, perambulating through those halls, looking at beautiful objects, making comments about the clothes that the people were wearing, both the people who were ambling around the galleries and the people in the paintings on the wall. You know, she would make all kinds of remarks about art, but not teaching me in a kind of art history way, but just how to look at objects in exactly the same way that we did in the department stores. And then the next weekend we'd go to another department store, and then the next weekend we'd go to the V&A and do the same thing. And I think because I've been doing this really since a very early age, you know, sort of, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years old, I sort of, the whole experience really merged and blended. I wasn't afraid of either place. I've never been afraid of going into shops, whether I could afford the items or not. And I feel very lucky now that I realize that some people find going to museums very difficult, but that I never had a problem with going to museums, and very much feel, and I'm always spreading the word, that the work in these public collections belongs to all of us who live here, pay our taxes here. That stuff on the wall is ours. And that was the kind of thing between the shop, where you can touch anything and everything, you can even try things on, but you don't own it till you buy it. And then in the museum, where you can't touch anything at all, you can't get even anywhere near it, but actually you own it all. And that's really the beginning of my experience of understanding these places. So I became, you know, I was affectionate towards them because I felt at home there, really. I mean, I suppose I was very, very young, you know, and it was in my early teenage years, so that's not sort of surprising. But there are works that I admired since I was a teenager. Works by Tissot. I think we've got some illustrations, some images we can show you. A work by Tissot, which is called Portsmouth Harbour, and another one which is called Ball on Shipboard. And one of the sort of early kind of ways of my understanding how kind of not so much casual, but familiar I felt about that particular collection was that I made work that responded to, for instance, those two paintings. You know, I was very free with my plundering of art history. I mean, I take art history very seriously on the one hand. I'm not anti-intellectual about it, but I realize that it's there for you can muck about with it. It's not something that I'm very kind of have much reverence towards. And so that early experience really helped me come to some realization that I could sort of affect those collections without knowing quite how. I didn't really understand how, but I realized that being in them, in those places, in those palaces of culture, if you like, we as audiences were affecting it somehow, and because it was affecting us. I suppose I've always thought that there were conversations to be had between audiences and collections, between audiences and museums. And I began to make work that kind of nodded in a kind of not so much jokey way, but very serious on the one hand. I was making work that was very much about how it was very almost impossible to see myself on the walls of those museums. So I started to, if you like, put myself on the walls of those museums without that work being in there. So can we show those first couple of slides? Yeah, the first one is, I call it Between the Two, My Heart is Balanced. It's from a painting by Tissot called Portsmouth Harbour. And in the original painting, two rather lovely women are in a little rowing boat, And between them is a sailor. And the three of them are going towards this enormous ship. And clearly, when they get to the ship, they're just in the harbour, when they get to the ship, he will get off and they will be rowed back. Now, the wonderful thing about the Tissot painting is that we, the audience, are in the boat with those women and that sailor. And I loved that. I absolutely loved that. I always loved it about the painting itself, which is a very tiny thing. And what I turned this into was two equally lovely women, but this time all of us are in the boat with them in the middle of the ocean. And they're not taking a sailor out to a big ship. They are ripping up maps and navigation charts to kind of undo, if you like, all the wrongs of the slave trade, the colonial legacy. I mean, it's a kind of impossible dream painting. And then the next one that I also stole, if you like, from the Tate, from those early memories, was another Tissot painting called Ball on Shipboard. And in his original painting, an absolutely divine gathering of clerks and maids on their day off, lounging about on a big kind of ferry thing, just taking the air, you know, at the weekends. Beautiful light, beautiful sort of elegance about it. Plenty of dresses, plenty of people touching in a kind of totally appropriate, but, you know, rather intimate sort of way. It's just divine. And so I undid that rather and presented a kind of a transition really between a set of paintings called the Rôdeur, which is about a slave ship that set off from the west coast of Africa, and part of the halfway through the journey, all of the French crew and most of the enslaved Africans, or soon to be enslaved Africans, went blind. I made a whole series of paintings about what it is to be in a place. You don't know that place, that's a ship, you don't know what a ship is. On the ocean, you don't know what an ocean is, you don't know where you're going, you don't know what will happen to you there. But a series of paintings that are about that unknowing. And this painting is sort of on the cusp of that, and another set of paintings that turned much more into an examination, I suppose, of what it is to fall in love. Lots of the paintings I make about those murderous times are to kind of point out that all those people that one hears called slaves were actually real human beings with real relationships, real families, real, real lives. So those two paintings kind of epitomize my early relationship with a big collection, where the memory of being able to enter into those paintings stayed with me.
So did you feel from a very young teenage time the absence of yourself in these collections?
I don't think I did at the front of my brain, but the minute I really started to think about that, the urge to then make those kind of paintings, that kind of work, was overwhelming. You know, I think I was storing that up, but I wasn't at all walking around those spaces thinking, where am I? I was thinking, what beautiful dresses those people are wearing, or what fantastic colors those are. Or if I was in the V&A, just totally in love with the ceramics, you know, the Islamic ceramics, the Chinese ceramics, you know. So I was just having a big love affair with those collections. But I think as I became in my late teens, my early 20s, I became more and more dissatisfied with how, you know, the cultural landscape looked, and tried to find a way to shift and change that if I could, have some effect on that. I suppose I turned to what epitomized for me everything that I loved and everything that represented some of the things I couldn't deal with anymore.
And what were those things you couldn't deal with?
well, that kind of erasure of those histories, the erasure of those stories, the lack of awareness on some people and institutions' part, the lack of truth, the lack of truth telling, and the kind of brushing out, whitewashing out of those histories. And I think that also I wasn't really showing in art galleries. I've always had much more able to have conversations about audiences, and I'm very, very interested in what curators think audiences do, what audiences think they're doing, and what artists, who are also audiences, of course, and curators, also think that audiences are doing. And frankly, we all think something completely different. And so you could have those sorts of conversations about how people reacted to, fell in love with, engaged with institutions, when you were talking about how people related to collections. Curators in museums understand that people come to see things that they love very much. But I know, and I think audiences know, that they also like to be surprised sometimes and see what they know and love very much in a different way. And so I was able really early on to persuade small collections, not those big institutions, but small collections or big collections in regional places, that I could make some work and temporarily place it within the object collections, just to perhaps try to shift the perception of what was being shown, or set up a kind of vibration, if you like, and leave a trace, so that when my work had gone, after being there for 6 weeks or something, there would be something about the work that was always on show, or that would be perhaps slightly different. I saw my role as kind of filling a gap, even though it would only be on a short-term basis. I was never making that work for it to be permanently in a collection.
And these were parts of long research projects, really, weren't they? So
yes.
Working with you, giving you lots of access to histories, who you were having a long conversation with in order to make the work as a sort of catalyst to describe it.
Absolutely. I first started, I suppose, at an early place that I worked with was the Ceramics Museum in Stoke. I was in the archives there, in the stores there, looking at everything that was there, wondering what was on show and what was in the store, which of course, as you would say, are two completely different things. Sometimes some things that are in the store never reach display, and some things that are on display are always on display, because actually also audiences love those things. So there would be an uproar if they ended up in the store. But I worked with places that allowed me to roam about at will. And one of the projects that I'm really very fond of, I got some images that Cicely is in charge of there, which was a piece called The Lancaster Dinner Service. And I made 100, well, I didn't make a single thing, do you know something? I bought 100 tureens, jugs, plates, and from junk shops, from Oxfam shops, charity shops, and so-called antique shops, all over the Northwest, for very tiny amounts of money. And I devised this dinner service on which I painted paintings of the slave servants that I imagined would be serving at the tables in Lancaster, which started off, its early wealth was made from the building of slave ships, rather inefficient slave ships, so they didn't last very long, and soon the building of those ships and the port became Liverpool rather than Lancaster. But the city kind of grew from that trade. So I painted also on the plates many of the people who had fought for the abolition of the slave trade. I painted people who were really disappointed that this abolition finally happened, because they were worried that they'd lose all their wealth, and tried to sort of build up a whole picture of how Lancaster was involved in this trade. And I spent weeks and weeks, Lancash's not very far from Preston, but I spent weeks and weeks actually walking around the city, looking at the architecture, talked to some very expert historians on the subject, Melinda Elder and Alan Rice. They showed me archive material, they showed me wills where slave servants were left from one family, one wealthy Lancaster family, to another family. And I could see how these people were, even though very, very few of them, we're not talking an American kind of system here, but these people were treated as goods. And the whole installation took place in a wonderful little museum called the Judges Lodgings. And it is what it says, it's the Judges Lodgings. But the dinner service was laid out on their fantastic Waring and Gillow, their Gillow table, which is made of mahogany. And the mahogany was shipped as ballast from the Americas back to Britain. So it formed, the material of that table formed part of the triangle. So the ship set off from Lancaster with iron goods, from the northwest, picked up Africans, shipped them across the Atlantic, sold them, and then had to pick up other materials as ballast to get them back to Lancaster. And the dinner service, wood from the dinner service, was part of that. So there was a sort of intervention into the little museum itself, into the city, and then into the bigger horror of that.
And how was the debate with the audience? So here's this rather sweet little museum.
Yeah.
You're describing another story that hasn't previously been articulated very clearly. Is there a productive debate that emerges from the sport?
I think so, because it's quite a city that's quite aware of itself. It's not very big, but there are lots of conversations that happen around that subject. Dr. Alan Rice has even made a slavery walk through, that you can buy as a map through the city. Those debates are really current. And people were very interested to learn more, and very interested to, some people, of course, who came to that museum were on their way to the lakes. So they would stop off in Lancaster, have a visit to the museum, and then they'd come across this dinner service, which in a sense, if you don't, which, most people don't, and why would you? You wouldn't necessarily know that it was a contemporary thing, because the plates are clearly old, even if some of them are only 100 years old, and some of them are 10 years old, but they had that air of being precious and valuable, and
and also are pretty much themselves part of the trade, part of that Chinese trade.
Yes, indeed. So they were greeted sometimes with just delight, because they were part of something that the whole museum is a delight. But there were plenty of opportunities in the kind of program while it was on for there to be talks, for there to be performances, for there to be walks around Lancaster, different kinds of lectures and different kinds of discussions. And that's what I really love about working with museums, that there is that possibility, and there's an openness to invite people in to tell, mostly, I have to say, for the audiences to be telling the curators something curators don't know. You know, I find there's real openness in that kind of museum, rather than the curators telling the audiences something they don't know. And there's a bit better balance there. So it was a great opportunity for that. And it was on show in that year, 2007, which was the 200th anniversary of the Act of Parliament abolishing the slave trade in Britain. Mm. So those debates were there in the air, and it kind of helped to make some of those things about contemporary slavery, about, you know, slavery today, just easier to speak about. I think lots of the time that curatorial staff and education outreach, development, whatever you want to call those curators, sometimes that kind of work helps bring out the conversations. You know, it doesn't seem so much like a lecture. It's more just like it's like a show and tell, an exchange of ideas, you know.
You talked about a little project that you made, I think at Tate or for Tate, a long time ago, where you worked with somebody else to research the contents of I suppose the collection through a particular prism.
Yeah.
And very gently presented that outcome. Do you want to talk a little about?
Yeah. Well, I worked for a long time with a really wonderful woman called Susan Walsh, and she really encouraged me to turn a lot of the materials that I collected over the past decades into an archive. But she was very, very interested in investigating things and using that investigation to present ideas. And we set about, and she did, to be perfectly frank, she did most of the work, going through every single artwork in the Tate collection, trying to work out, one way or another, by discussion and by looking things up, how many works they had that were made by Black artists. And this was in 2005. And so she compiled this list, we made this list, we double checked it, and of course I knew many artists at that time who were not in the collection. So we devised this little film on a CD, on a DVD, and a booklet. And the booklet listed all the artists that they did have in the collection, all the exhibitions that they had made, the displays they had made of Black artists' work, but then all the artists that they could maybe think about collecting if they had the time or the money. And I presented this at Tate Liverpool, but at the time it didn't really get too much traction. I gave it out to lots of curators at Tate Britain and as well. And I think some people put it in their drawer. Some people probably put it in the bin. And some people, I think, it sparked off some debates, some conversations, and eventually, I think, some purchases of work for the collection. But there was never really any face-to-face feedback. But I'm kind of used to that. I'm used to putting a thing, an idea on the table, and if you want to pick it up, you can, and if you don't, well, somebody else will eventually anyway. So, but it was a great project to do. In a way, it's probably enormous and the biggest thing I've ever done, but because I never heard anything I never had a proper debate about it, now it seems kind of rather small and fragile. But I think it was important. It was important at the time, and highlighted, that I have an argument with museums and collections, and I'm very fond of what of the potential there, of what the possibilities there are for artists, for young people to, if you like, in the best possible sense of the word, play with the space, you know, imagine in the space in a way that it's quite difficult to do anywhere else, you know. It's sort of
we see big collections like Tate, who are hugely scholarly, have incredible conservation departments, very influential internationally in the debate around conservation. Then smaller museums that have beautiful little collections but struggle to have a direction or have agency, probably because of an economy. So it seems to me that the artist has a very strong role to play amongst, you know, in museums generally, but perhaps in terms of the conversations with those smaller museums.
Yes, I think so, because I think we very often, artists know those museums very well. You know, having approached them as either when one was very young or at art school or design school, or, you know, I think the benefit is that artists have relationships with collections and museums that they had before they were actually artists. So they have really quite a rounded sort of view. And I think, yeah, I mean, you know, everyone who knows me knows I'm a great believer in the potential for artists to explore things and see them inside out and back to front and upside down in a way that doesn't frighten us. And because so many of us deal with the world in completely different ways than each other, you know?
But also art collections are like time capsules, a little bit like that project that you did with Susan.
Yeah.
Time capsule that sits and waits till somebody discovers it and it explodes. But collections are time. They tell you, they have the audacity, I suppose, to suggest that they tell you about the world that they were collected in, or they tell you about the world at the time in which they were created, as this collection around me does. But it only tells a very small story of a particular prism of that time. And I think to be able to influence that, and I know that you've gifted works to certain museums with that in mind.
Yeah, I mean, gifting, it's pretty difficult. It might not be that difficult now, but it was difficult when I was trying to do it. Yeah, I mean, we can have the piece up on the screen now. I think Naming the Money is there now. This is an installation that I made in 2004. 4 or 5, I think, of 100 painted wooden cutouts. So there's 100 pieces. There's a 72-minute soundtrack. And on the back of every figure is the story of this figure's life, just in 5 lines. And I made it in response to the collection at the Hatton Gallery, which is the university gallery in Newcastle University, where I was invited by Lucy Whetstone to look at the collection and make a piece in response to it. And of course, it was a funny little collection. Hatton are not going to mind me saying, you know, it wasn't full of great works, but I was a bit kind of desperate as to what to do. But I found about 25 boxes of pieces of fabric that eventually we realized were gifted to the collection some 20, 30, 40 years before. And they were small pieces of European fabric, sort of cuffs and collars and parts of shirts and parts of pieces of clothing. Very, very beautiful. And I kind of translated this into sort of lost and yet found people. And made reference to the slave servants. So in all the paintings I'd ever seen, that stand at the side and are holding a horse or holding a teapot or, holding a bit of dress or something. And other paintings.
Taking a sneaky drink.
Yes. So I gathered all these people together in one room, and well, in 3 rooms, because there are 100 people. It's rather a large installation, and I made it for that gallery to be shown there, and then taken away and make it for a collection. But then it occurred to me, in the kind of brave and rude kind of person I was then, it occurred to me it would look great if it was part of Tate's collection, if it was in the, you could see it in Tate Britain, in the Duveen galleries. I thought, oh, that would be a great idea if they owned it. I'll see if they want to have it. But it's not the sort of thing I do now, of course. But anyway, 2 years, I presented it, and in 2 years went by, but they said no, they didn't want it. So I thought, okay, no problem. I know a better place, actually, who might be able to make even more use of it, and that was the Slavery Museum in Liverpool. And they and the curators at the Walker Gallery accepted it as a gift. So they have 90 of the 100 cutouts. I have the other 10. And ever since then, ever since I gifted to them, they have used it in the galleries themselves, and they have loaned it out to the big show at Spike Island. They've loaned it out in Bordeaux, to a huge, wonderful exhibition that I had there. Another one in Sérignan, and so it's been out and about ever since I gifted it to the Slavery Museum and the Walker Art Gallery, Liverpool museums in general. And I think it's in the right place with the right set of people who really kind of understand what it means to the city that it's in, Liverpool, and understand what it means in relation to lots of the work that's in the Walker Art Gallery, and understand how important those conversations are that can be generated. So I think actually, in the end, it's in a much, much better place.
And you felt that you had to gift it rather than sell, didn't you?
Well, I couldn't ever make a piece of work that was 100 slave servants. I mean, listen to it. I couldn't sell it. It would be obscene. It would be disgusting. It was never ever made to sell. It would be impossible. It's impossible. I just wanted it to be used.
Can I ask a really practical question, which I think, nevertheless, is really important? Is about conservation of that work. It must, there must be some very beautifully designed crates in which those flats are kept. But there still must also be quite a lot of repair that you are asked to do from time to time. Well,
no, I don't have to do the repair, actually. If there's any repair, then Liverpool Museums would do it, because of course they have fantastic conservation department there, really big and wonderful. And then, yeah, I mean, that was the point. Them taking it on was not, do we want this work? Is it any good? It was totally about, have we got room for all this? Have we got the money to store them and restore them forever? And for them to take it on in, I don't know when they took them now. Maybe 2010 or something like that. I mean, a long time ago, before Lubaina Himid won the Turner Prize, they took the work really seriously and what they could do with it really seriously, and have really used it, and when it goes out to be shown in other places, someone goes with it, condition checks it when it comes out of its wrapping, condition checks it when it's going back in its wrappings, condition checks it again when it gets back to, Liverpool. So it's a whole big, thing that has to go on.
Take on a big work like that.
It's incredibly, yeah. I should be forever grateful to them, because I could never make Naming the Money ever again. And for me,
experiencing it as well, isn't there? So they, you know, that's why they've taken it on, because they realise how much what it does and how it resonates.
Yeah, they understood that, which was incredible. But I do realise it's a big, big deal. You know. It's pretty tough, you know, plywood and acrylic paint, but still, children do like to run in and out of it and round and round.
So I'm not, because I can't see your images, I'm not sure what the next image might be that you want to actually pull out from Cicely's direction.
We'll keep going through have you got some more naming the monies, Cicely? Oh no, oh yes, I know. Let's have a look. Yeah, let's have that We Will Be up on the screen, which is what you've got. Sorry, the woman there that you had on the screen. Yep. Let's have that. Because this also is another kind of chapter in my relationship with the museums in Liverpool. Some time ago, I'm terrible at remembering dates actually, and if they're watching, they'll be shouting at me through the screen. A curator there asked me whether I would donate a work to the collection. I mean, you know, to the Walker rather than Liverpool Museums as a whole thing. And I said, well, what other Black women have you got in your collection? And she said, well, the only thing we've got is a very beautiful sculpture of Longfellow by a white beardy man, by an African-American artist called Edmonia Lewis. Now I know absolutely tons and tons about Edmonia Lewis. I could bore you for very many hours, but she just was the most marvelous sculptor. And I thought, okay, this is a kind of strange, there's a strange piece that that she's made. You know, it isn't a sculpture of an African person, but she's a very, very important sculptor in that kind of you know, marble 19th century way. And so I presented them with this piece called We Will Be. And it's a really, really early cutout of mine, a life-size sort of cutout, a bit bigger than life-size. And it's got all sorts of funny things in it. You know, it's completely the opposite to a marble sculpture, really. More conservation issues like mad. It's got drawing pins stuck in it. It's got little bits of wool hanging off it and collage. So it's a kind of conservator's nightmare in a sense. And also, because also children quite like to lean in and touch it, because that's what it was meant for. It wasn't really meant as something very grand and special and distant. Anyway, my strategy was to donate this work. It could be in a kind of strange conversation with Edmonia Lewis, but what we've really been trying to do ever since is have conversations about other Black women's work that can also join these two works in the collection. And I think that's going to be a sort of long-term project that I'll have with them. They're setting up sort of, they've been acquiring work steadily since we started to have those conversations. But I think we're going to develop it into an even more strategic and sort of future project. So I had that in mind. I thought one is not enough. You know, you can't have, none of us like to be the only Black person in a room. Two is okay, but you know, we've got different things we want to say. So there need to be many of us. And so in that way, I accepted an invitation, but wanted to use the work in that way, in this case, to sort of to help them build the collection. So the really young artists that I want them to acquire, and some of the established artists that, you know, have been going a long time. It's an incredibly important city to have those conversations in.
So I think you've already slightly started that with us too, because you've exchanged your fee for tonight for us to purchase work for our collection, which is something that we will discuss with you as we move forward. So you've already started negotiating with.
Oh, well, I'm always negotiating.
We're delighted with that idea. Yes, of course. We're going to move into questions now. So if people would like to put things into the chat room, whilst they're ticking along though, I'm going to ask you one final question about how you're preparing for your show in November, because it's a gargantuan task of bringing so much work together. And I think there might be one or two things that would be very fascinating for us to know about how you go about doing that. Just questions start coming into the inbox.
Well, of course, I get very excited and very worried about it, but I have, you know, I've got a really good studio team who help me keep calm and work things out. And of course, Hollybush Gardens, my gallery, also are really on it, you know, helping locate and helping with loans and all that sort of thing. And the curators are actually being very kind to me, so that's helpful and good as well. Of course, those conservation issues come up. You know, I'm always fighting the barrier. I never want barriers in front of my work in shows, but you just have to have them. And I always like to have really bright light on my work. But of course, when it's a big show like that, also in those big museums, you can't do that either. So the light is bright, but not as bright as I would have it, you know. So those are the things that play on my mind in terms of collections and that show. But I suppose I'm trying to make an exhibition that audiences will allow themselves to be the star. That's the point. You go into this show and it's you take on this persona that you are the central player in the room. And you just use my work to kind of build up your ammunition and your talismans and your information to get on with your life at the other end of the exhibition.
In much the same way as you did when you did your weekend trips with your mother, perhaps, as you were.
Perhaps, yes. Just yeah.
And you can show that painting next to the original. That's what they were saying to me, that you can.
Yeah, they did do that once, actually.
Oh, they're not doing it for this. Okay.
No.
Okay. So Cicely, where are we with the questions in the chat from Beth? You want to ask your question, Beth?
Yes, I can do that if I can remember what it was. I've written it down. There we are. Hi, Lubaina. Lovely to see you there. That was really fascinating, and I loved your introduction to thinking about buildings with objects in and department stores, and thinking about trips to shops with my mum when I was very small, and that joy of being amongst things, making sense of things and being allowed to be in places. It was, yeah, so it was a really lovely connection to make. But I'm thinking about how, given that you have such, your practice has focused for so long on responding to and exploring collections and being invited to highlight the problems that have arisen through processes of collecting over the years, and our cultural approach to collecting and display. And my question was around how you approach those projects. Is it always a similar approach, or does it differ from project to project? Do you start with objects in stores, or what is being selected to be on display, or does it come from conversations with the curators? What's your starting point?
Yeah, well, it does. It absolutely depends on where it is, you know, what it is. I mean, in a way, with the Lancaster Dinner Service, I started with the city itself. I needed to feel what it was like to be a slave servant in that city. So where would I go? What were the streets like? I was looking at walls and weeds and the sky and just imagining that I was one of those people, you know, whose job it was to serve food and clean up, you know. And then with I don't know, with other things, yeah, it's quite often is about the city, and then what's inside the museum is a way of. Sometimes I suppose I see cities, museums, a little bit like sort of mini versions of the city or the town that they're in. So they're places in which you can have a conversation and make comments and make responses and meet people that are not as big as the place. So my jelly mold pavilions for Liverpool talked about making a monument in Liverpool that might recognise and acknowledge the contribution that Black people had made to that city, but by building a monument. But I didn't want to build a monument. I wanted to sort of set up a fake architectural competition. So I made the models were ceramic jelly molds. So really I'm thinking about cities a lot, and then using museums as a sort of a mini version. Looking in the store is something I always want to do. Yes, of course. Who doesn't want to look in the store? I mean, all of us. I think it's incredibly important. And I think there's sort of places that have open store days. You know, that's good if you can't put the stuff on display. So even if they're kind of sort of curated, if you like, it's better than not being able to see into the store. It opens up the museum without you having to spend a lot of money bringing in another show. You know, it's a whole other experience. And I know Lucy agrees, but I think audiences are really, really keen on that. Artists are really keen on that. So yeah, all sorts of different ways really, but usually I did something, I described the work I made with the Hatton. That was very random. I came across these boxes of fabrics accidentally. And I know Lucy Whetstone at the time wished I hadn't come across them. Like, oh no, please don't look up there. I don't know what that's, what was
rifling in someone's attic. You're like, oh,
yeah, like, oh, I haven't sorted that box. I've only just come across the job. I don't know what those are. Anyway, we sorted it in the end, and those fabrics with them, there was the money to beautifully conserve them. So sometimes something comes of that. I also was looking in the collection at Platt Hall, which is part of Manchester Museums now, and made a series called Striker, Taylor, somebody on there, there'll be an art historian on there somewhere, who knows what it's called, Taylor Striker, Dandy, something or other. And so I made a series of paintings of men in fabulous costumes from looking at that collection. So usually I'm looking in the stores, but looking at what's on display as well, because that's a kind of portal through which, that's the immediate, you know. But also, you know, with the Platt Hall show, I was interested in people that lived really quite near that museum, because the communities who live very near the museum, which is a long way down the road from the centre of Manchester, so it's one big long road, lots of museums in it, right at the end by, you know, out at Platt Hall and the playing fields there, the communities were not coming into the museum. So I also wanted to make something that would help the curators set up some workshops, some projects, some exchange discussions, some performance things, that then there would be a little bit of something that they had on show that could kind of make a little bit of a bridge between the conversations that were going on.
Like you've described in that, museums as miniature versions of cities and as portals and as bridges, which I think are the most amazing descriptions of what museums and collections can do and what they can, that can be. It's really generous. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Lubaina and Beth. So we've got another question, and I believe that Rain, we would like to read the question loud. We'll say it aloud.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for the talk. It's been really interesting. I was quite taken by one of the, I think it's the title of either the work or the installation at Hospitalfield, called Dreaming Has a Share in History. I was just really taken by this idea, finding it very poetic. I just wanted to ask if you could speak a little bit more about it. Mainly kind of how you link dreaming to a history which now we debate upon. And what kind of dreaming were you talking about?
Well, I suppose usually the kind of dreaming I'm talking about is kind of wishing kind of dreaming, rather than I had this terrible dream last night. Not that kind of dreaming, but dreaming of how things could be different, dreaming of how we can change, can't change histories, but we could change futures by knowing more about histories. So that kind of, instead of being saddled with the burden of history, I think it's just better to think about history as an ongoing thing, as a fluid thing, that we can take the information, take the facts, learn the facts, tell the truths, deal with how we deal with it as living human beings now, and see how we can, and know that we can actually have a part in changing futures by knowing and being really clear about what the histories actually are. So it's about opening up the histories, being very honest and probably very argumentative about what the truth of a history is, but actually daring to dream that we could, with that information and that knowledge, change some stuff. So that's really what I'm talking about in that piece.
Dreaming, daring to dream. That you
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the next person who'd like to speak actually is just making a comment. If
Okay.
you'd like to speak next.
So slow, isn't it? This Zoom question process. There's no.
Sorry.
Where is that person?
So otherwise, I can read the question.
Yeah.
Well, the comment aloud. So Lillian was just saying, I loved what you said about making an art piece to offset or offer a certain vibration to the collection. I loved also what you said about inviting the audience in as a central player. And there's no question, but Lillian would like to say that they're very much looking forward to seeing your show in November. Thank you.
Oh, great. That's great. That's great.
Buy the tickets now. I looked online and you can buy the tickets already.
Oh, can you?
Yes.
That's a bit worrying. Okay.
Not one.
That's the most frightening thing anyone's said all day.
Oh, sorry.
We have a question from Mark. If you'd like to unmute yourself.
Hi, Lubaina. Thank you for this wonderful presentation this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I just wanted to ask you a quick question. When you were speaking to the role of imagination in your work, and then sort of, I loved how you introduced your practice. I've never heard you speak about that before, with the sort of the contrast between the retail environment and sort of this idea of ownership, purchase, and then having that flipped to sort of be the reflexive version of it with institution, national collection. I'm wondering if you could perhaps speak to, you know, in your mind's eye, or what do you feel are the strategies that museums, institutions, collaborative platforms can best pursue in order to make sure that we don't stifle or hinder imagination? Like,
Oh, that's a small question.
I know, I'm so sorry.
Well, first of all, it's totally disconcerting because the image you have behind you is my show at the new museum. I looked at it and I'm thinking, I know that stuff. That looks really familiar. Oh yes, go at the new museum. So that's a bit frightening.
Yeah,
Then you're asking me a question about strategies. Well, I mean, I've outlined some of them already. I mean, I think sometimes it's being daring enough to speak with artists who are not the biggest, fanciest artists. Do you know? The biggest, fanciest artists, of course, can do great things, you know, and Grace and Perry and great things, the British Museum and all that sort of thing. But sometimes there are some, I mean, I know some really, really clever artists who are brilliant at investigating something in a very passionate and a very singular way that isn't about sales and isn't about stardom. Of course, I'm sure they'd like that to happen, but they're as real as you can get, as near as you can get to the audiences for museums, because they're curious, they're questioning, you know, they want to turn something inside out, they want to find something new, you know. So the strategy has to be daring enough to attempt to get out there or ask us artists that you know about other artists and other artists that they know. Start to have real conversations with real people rather than always having sort of shiny conversations with artists that are shiny already, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. I think it's interesting in this time of social isolation how the technology that we have is available. It's sort of flattening the hierarchy in many ways into whom we can make contact with and why. So I feel that if anything, there is a potentiality here in this sort of platform to reach out to those sort of underrepresented voices and ideas. So thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate it.
And then always follow up. I would want to say to curators,
absolutely,
if you don't want to go, you don't want to give these artists some show, you know, because you think, oh, well, that's not quite what I had in mind. But then you could do something else. You could have, you know, do a talk, or perhaps they could do a tour of the collection, or, you know, follow up in some way, help them then develop and meet other people. You know, artists need to meet other people as well. You could help introduce artists to artists, or artists to musicians, or artists to writers. That sort of thing is really vital as well.
Thank you very much.
Cicely, I'm going to point to this question that Elke Ritt has asked about a show that you did in Karlsruhe in 2017.
Oh yeah.
The Truth is Never Watertight. The question is, did you have a chance to engage with local audiences?
Well, yeah, because
that's so much a part. I mean, it's not just audiences, but all the work emerges out of so many conversations, so many networks of engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I put on that show, one of the research fellows that was working with me at the time, still works with me, is a woman called Christina Yene, and she's also the director of the Casablanca Biennale. And I asked her to put together a list for me of Black artists working in Germany, so that I could introduce some of them to, working in Germany rather than just working in Karlsruhe. And I could introduce them to the curators at the Badische Kunstverein. And what we then did was invited 4 or 5 artists, some from Berlin and some from nearer Karlsruhe, to come and talk about their work in my show. So they were talking about their work, presenting their work, but my show was a sort of platform for that. And I think that what came from that, well, lots of people from the city came to that talk and then were able to talk to me about my show, them about their work. And it started, again, something that was quite small, but I think bigger conversations have happened since then. So yes, I did. But curators came, of course, to that talk, and curators from the Ludwig came, as well as local people. Saturday afternoon, let's see what these people had to say. But of course, we were doing the talk in English and German as well, because all these Black artists who were living in Germany, of course, spoke German. So that I found is really important. My German is reduced to beer and sausages and things to eat, but I think it's very important when I have a show somewhere else that artists that a little bit what I was saying a moment ago, that artists who are working in those places. It happened in Sérignan in France as well. We found lots of artists, Black artists working in France, and invited them to be part of some conversations around being displayed and being collected. And very often those are the sorts of conversations that bring in local audiences, because you're doing something that's a bit different than usually happens.
So the fact that you've had such success in the past 5, 6, 7 years has given you greater power, I suppose. The more opportunities you have to show, the more power of persuasion you have to ensure that those institutions and museums are engaging in the way that you want to with other artists. That must give you a lot of, that must be very pleasing.
It's unbelievably pleasing. It's like, it was totally liberating and energizing, that I'm able to say, please, could you look at this person's work, because I think it's really interesting. And I'm always only saying, will you look at it? Can we talk about it? Because obviously everyone has to make up their own minds, but I really love to do that. Yeah.
Because of course, so many artists like yourself have been teaching for years. So you have this great generations of artists who you've inspired through your teaching, and now through your exhibition making.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many I inspired through my teaching, to be perfectly honest, but I work with a lot of really good artists, in the university where I'm still working, but also, from making shows in the early 80s, and then I'm always looking to have conversations with artists that I don't know. I'm not sure about how inspiring.
So I think we're coming to the end, probably coming to the end, probably overshot, but I just want to, before we leave, I just want to just have a little opportunity for you to describe your archive, because in a way it's another work, but it's a collection.
Yes, well, from 40 years ago or whatever, when I was making exhibitions with other people's work, I wasn't curating, I was sort of encouraging people to exhibit with me. And we were a kind of very loose group, women like Claudette Johnson and Ingrid Pollard, Maud Salter, Sonia Boyce, Veronica Ryan. And I have all sorts of stuff, letters, posters, invites, all that kind of thing, all sorts of letters to galleries where they were saying, dear Lubaina, your work is rubbish, we don't want it, we don't want you to have a show, all that stuff. I kept it all. And but I kept it in my house. And after many years, I thought, do you know something? I think I would just chuck all this stuff away, because just bringing me down and making me unhappy. Because I started a project, that kind of project of trying to change the face of British art. And I thought, I can't make it, I'm not making it work. And the same Susan Walsh, who did all that going through the collections, said, no, don't throw it away. It'll be useful one day. Don't chuck it out. I'll file everything, every letter, every invite, every poster, every brochure. every book, and we'll set up an archive space at the university, and students can come and look at this stuff, and maybe artists will come and learn how you think that project failed, and they can do it better. And I think that was the point for me, that I thought, well, this way of doing things doesn't work. It was much too negotiating. It wasn't angry enough. It wasn't powerful enough. I didn't know enough important people. But so I wanted to show that we'd done it once in the 1980s, and I wanted artists and curators and art historians and students from the university and anyone to come and look at this and think, I know what they did wrong. This is the way to do it. And I think it served the purpose, for the past decade, in that it is a very small collection of work. It is mostly centered on what a particular group of Black women were doing. And the collection has built quite a lot since then. People have contributed things, or made their own shows out of coming to the archive. Some artists have come to the archive, looked at work either that they made a long time ago, some reference to it, or found some book that they hadn't engaged with before, and then worked in the print room, which is about a few meters along in the same building in the university, and made work that responds both to the archive and our most spectacular print room. So quite a lot of interconnecting, bigger conversations have kind of come out of that. And again, I think it's served its purpose as preserving some things that I would have thrown away, but also as a catalyst for thinking about different ways of curating, because Christine Ayene works with me there. As I said, the Casablanca Biennale director. Zoe Whitley, who's now runs Chisenhale, did her PhD with me there. And so Helen Kamek has come to work in the print room there. Ingrid Pollard has come to work in the print room. So it served as a catalyst for other things to happen. I think that's the way also to think about an archive, as it's not some dead thing with dead things in it, made by dead people. It's something that's there so you can make living things, now things from it.
Yes, that's a lovely way to end. This idea of the archive is the thing that inspires the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that we must all hold very dear. So I'd like to say thank you very much to Lubaina, and thank you to everybody who joined us this evening.
Yeah, it's lovely.
And long may we continue to talk about collections and the important collections in our lives, and we will all see you in November at your exhibition.
Yeah, great, come along.
So thank you so much for joining us, and have a lovely summer. We're waiting for the summer to arrive, aren't we?
Yeah, we'll keep waiting. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Cicely, for organising the tech. It's great. Thanks. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.